Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with one of the great physicians of the 20th century, Donnall Thomas. Dr. Thomas died recently at the age of 92, and he's responsible for one of the great discoveries of our generation, a discovery which has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. If you look at the great breakthroughs in medicine in the second half of the 20th century after World War II, it would have to include things like antibiotics, vaccinations, the CT scan, but unquestionably one of the greatest breakthroughs was the technique of organ transplantation, where we take an organ from one patient that's well matched to the failing organ of another patient and transplant it, and thereby extend the second patient's life even though they had a failing organ. It was first done with kidneys, then with livers, hearts, now it's been done with things like pancreas and small bowel. What Dr. Thomas did was Dr. Thomas figured out that the bone marrow was actually an organ, and he figured out the technique of bone marrow transplantation. And essentially, he was able to treat diseases which were previously untreatable, like leukemia, by transplanting the bone marrow of a compatible patient into one with leukemia or some other blood disorder where the bone marrow was failing, and see them survive successfully. Childhood leukemia especially has been one of the successes that we've seen since the introduction of bone marrow transplant. But there have been a number of other diseases in both children and adults that were formerly universally fatal, where bone marrow transplantation has literally saved people's lives. Dr. Thomas was a member of the University of Washington Hematology Department for many years at the Fred Hutchinson Center, and in 1990 he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine, a well-deserved honor. Here is a report on Dr. Donnall Thomas from the Fred Hutchinson Medical Center.
Dr. Donnall Thomas won the Nobel Prize for his development of bone marrow transplantation. His pioneering efforts resulted in revolutionary new medical procedures used to treat and cure tens of thousands of leukemia and lymphoma patients every year.
The experiment of human marrow transplantation taught us not just a technique that is curative for thousands of individuals, but really it taught us how the immune system can accept or reject grafts, and it taught us how the immune system can get rid of malignancies.
Dr. Thomas began his research in bone marrow biochemistry in 1947. By 1955, he had developed techniques to obtain human marrow cells and prepare them for safe transplantation into patients.
At that time, the diagnosis of leukemia was a sentence of death, always in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or months. And it was obvious that this was an area where there could be some improvement. To me, that was an open opportunity for research. We knew that leukemia was very sensitive to radiation and high doses of drugs. So the idea was, why not treat a patient with very high doses of drug, enough to destroy their bone marrow, and to transplant bone marrow from someone else.
It wasn't just developing a new technique, but it was developing a new technique that the vast majority of hematologists and oncologists said was impossible, or worse, that it was unethical and it was immoral to try it. One had to have enormous strength and belief to persist.
In those days, the chemotherapy of leukemia had not been developed as well, and it was being developed at approximately the same time. So there was no alternative. If we had 1 out of 30 patients who lived a year.
Joy when you see somebody walk out of the hospital assuming they're alive again, and it's probably one of the greatest feelings you can have.
Well, I think Don is the epitome of the Dr. Schweitzer, the dedicated doctor whose only mission in life is to bring some new insight to patient care. He's that simple in a way.
We oftentimes were depressed because an experiment just didn't work out again. And so Don, kept faith, actually, and said, well, just try again. So we tried again. Having a steady hand at the rudder at the time was very important.
I actually asked many colleagues to give me a funny story about Don, and we all agreed there are no funny stories about Don. None. He had a mission. There was nothing funny about it.
A lot of people have said if Don's the father of bone marrow transplantation, then surely Dottie is the mother. She always was there quietly at Don's side, keeping records, correcting papers. I suspect that many of the intellectual insights had a lot of Dottie's influence in them. I think it's almost impossible to separate the two because the two are always together.
We were both in the University of Texas, and I was waiting tables at the girls' dormitory. And when I went out of the dormitory that morning, lo and behold, it had snowed in Austin, Texas. The first thing I knew, a young lady that I didn't know hit me in the face with a snowball. So I had to catch her and roll her in the snow and so on. And that's how I met Dottie.
Well, actually, I was not aiming at Don. I was aiming at someone else, but I never could throw straight, so I hit him.
In 1990, Dr. Thomas's years of groundbreaking research in bone marrow transplantation and immunology received international recognition with recipiency of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine.
You know, it's a big jump from medical school where you're learning to do what has already been shown to be beneficial. But as soon as you think you might be able to improve on what's being done, then it becomes a real burden and at the same time a challenge. To me, that was the most exciting thing.
Dr. Thomas's research is the genesis of immunotherapy, the harnessing of the body's immune system to effectively fight not only cancer, but other diseases as well.
Every cancer center would aspire to create new approaches to curing cancer, but very few have had that good fortune. Don and Dottie's work really created a completely new paradigm for cancer treatment that we continue to exploit to this day.
One of the major legacies of marrow transplantation will be not just the development of a curative technique today, but it will be the establishment of immunotherapy as a technique that will be able to cure thousands of patients of many different diseases in the future.
And then ultimately, we hope we're going to create new immunotherapies for cancer that will, conceivably eradicate the disease. That could be the long-term legacy.
Dr. E. Donnall Thomas changed the world forever by offering hope where there once was none. Today, more than 50,000 patients worldwide undergo bone marrow or stem cell transplants every year. The benefits of his decades of work will reach far into the future as hundreds of thousands of cancer patients become cancer survivors. And the spirit of his vision will continue to be reflected in the hearts and efforts of everyone at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center.
One of the things that the report mentioned is that you will see in the future bone marrow transplantation employed for diseases where the immune system is failing in one way or another. And we have Dr. Thomas to thank for that. In the early part of my medical career, patients with leukemia were considered to have an untreatable fatal disease. Today, they are routinely treated and live for long periods of time. Dr. Thomas is a true 20th century medical hero. We're going to move on now with Russell Means. Russell Means is an Ogallala Lakota Sioux Indian who died recently at the age of 72, and Mr. Means was a prominent spokesman, if not the most prominent spokesman, for the Native American movement, especially in the 1970s. The civil rights movement of the 1960s spawned other movements for minority rights, including women's rights, gay rights, and Native American rights. These all began in earnest in the late 1960s. And the Native American rights were most prominently displayed in Occupy movements that were meant to highlight the plight of the Native American and the grievances they had against the federal government. So at various times in the early 1970s, you had Native American occupying movements of Mount Rushmore, of Alcatraz, and most importantly, in 1973 at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. 83 years before, in 1890, Wounded Knee had been the site of the last battle of the Indian Wars. On December 29, 1890, 2 weeks after Chief Sitting Bull, one of the Lakota chiefs who remained defiant of the U.S. military, was killed. The U.S. 7th Cavalry, the same outfit that George Custer had led before he was killed at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the 7th Cavalry killed between 150 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children at Wounded Knee. For all intents and purposes, that ended the last Indian resistance in the United States. The attack was especially brutal by the cavalry. There was an element of revenge for Custer, and it remained a sticking point with the Native Americans for the next 80 years. In February of 1973, a group of about 200 Oglala Lakota and the leaders of the American Indian movement occupied Wounded Knee at the Pine Ridge Reservation for 71 days. 2 Native Americans and 1 U.S. Marshal were killed during the conflict before the land was given back to the United States government. Russell Means was one of the main spokesmen for the Native Americans. The highly publicized episode galvanized Native Americans and regular citizens across the United States and became a rallying cry for greater Native American rights. Here is a news report from a South Dakota news station about the occupation while it was going on in 1973, with Russell Means as the spokesman being recorded.
The militant American Indian movement called this meeting to seek the support of the tribal elders of the Pine Ridge Reservation for a bold plan to force federal attention to Indian demands. Not all of the hereditary chiefs attended, and among those who did, it was clear there was not total support for the militants. The elders were being challenged to defy the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian establishment, which historically directed their lives.
The Oglala Nation is at a crossroads that can change the course of history for Indian people all across the nation. And sometimes there has to be violence to force the white man to listen. You leaders, the chiefs, have to be right there with us when we do it. But we seize Wounded Knee. Either we force the federal government to kill us all once again like they did 83 years ago at Wounded Knee, or else they come out and they negotiate and meet our demands.
The chiefs advised there be more meetings with other Indians. They agreed there should be change, but wanted to wait a bit longer.
Ultimately, the situation was resolved. Russell Means went on to an acting career. He was in Michael Mann's Last of the Mohicans, and we still don't have enough in the way of Native American rights and redress today. Wounded Knee has become a well-known name in American history books twice. Once in 1890 because of the last battle of the Indian Wars, and secondly for the 1973 occupation, which has become to Native American rights what the March on Washington was to civil rights and the Stonewall riots were to gay rights. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer Sid Tepps. Our closing music tonight is by the best Native American rock group that the United States has produced, Redbone, founded by Patrick and Lolly Vasquez. I love Redbone. They did a great song called Witch Queen in New Orleans, which I urge you all to listen to. Their big hit was Come and Get Your Love, but they also did a song about Wounded Knee. In tribute to Russell Means, here is Redbone with We Were All Wounded at Wounded Knee. Listen to a copy of the whole thing sometime. It's a great song.
We were all wounded at Wounded Knee. You and me, we were all wounded at Wounded Knee. You and me, in the name of manifest destiny. You and me.